Welcome to the first ever session of the first ever SIGGRAPH Next venue. This is an experimental venue that we'll be working with for the next 3 years. So it's we're really interested in hearing your feedback on the topics, the forum, how that works as we continue to evolve it. Please do continue to help yourself to coffee and water. This room runs a little hot, so if you need water to wake yourself up, please go ahead and do that. So the inspiration behind this venue was literally, what is next for SIGGRAPH? It's terribly clever, the title. But the idea is there's a lot of expertise, skill sets in our industry that have applications in other universes. There's also a lot of major issues in our industry that appear solved. You know, the first time I came to SIGGRAPH in the mid-'80s, fur, feather, fire, like they weren't rendered so well. Now they're really rendered well. And so there's an opportunity to apply the skill sets we have in other industries or towards other challenges. Today we're talking about the future. The future is waiting. We have with us Bob and Dylan. A lot of folks may have known Bob from prior work with the SIGGRAPH. He's been on conference committees and a routine contributor. He's currently with Blizzard. Dylan is with the Institute for the Future. Has anyone ever worked with them? They're a remarkable he's with the military, that guy. He's worked with you. The Institute for the Future is a remarkable little hidden gem. It's a nonprofit organization that specializes in collecting massive amounts of data and making very educated decisions about where we're going in the future. I've worked with them professionally in the 94, 95, 96, and they predicted MySpace. And we're all like, oh my God, well, teenagers have always hung out somewhere, right? Whether it was a stoop or a mall or a digital space. So on the one hand, it was genius. On the other hand, it was kind of predictable based upon the information they have. So this morning, we're talking about advancing technologies, how that will impact the future, how the skill sets we have can contribute to that, and how it'll continue to educate us. Tomorrow morning session in this same space at the same crack of dawn hour, we'll be talking about machine learning, vision systems, and how those are being applied to medicine right now. Again, two folks who are very heavily involved in the SIGGRAPH Tech Papers program will be presenting how they've expanded their research into the medical community. And on Wednesday morning, we have Tony DeRose from Pixar will be here to talk about the future of education. He's done some really neat things with Pixar in a Box. I don't know if you've seen that online, free training in partnership with Khan Academy on 3D animation and modeling. And also he put together an entire curriculum for middle schoolers in Makerspace. So that's what we'll have for the next 2 days. Ideally, this is a conversation. Please feel free to ask questions. We have mics in the center there, or I have a mic I can run around to you. This session will be recorded and will be online. It's going to be a bit of a podcast because the recording is the screen and the voices. But this will be posted online, and we hope to have a community of interest that continues this conversation over the next year, and that hopefully can then inform the sort of topics you're interested in seeing as we move forward in the future. What are you doing? What's interesting? How are you applying skill sets that might be traditional to all of us in new areas? So we will run from till 8:45 this morning, and off you go, gentlemen.
Oh, boy. Okay. Thanks, MK. Welcome again at this crazy hour. I don't think I've ever been to a SIGGRAPH at 8 a.m. unless I was working the exhibitor floor many years ago. I want to give you a little context how all this started. I was at SIGGRAPH last year, and I ran into MK in the hall, and she said, well, what do you think? This is, it's like, yeah, I got a problem. And the problem is nobody's talking about the condition of today, where we're at, what's coming, and what does it look like? And there's a lot of things going on out there that I think that we should be having some dialogue about. And she looked at me like MK can look at you. And I said, oh, crap, I think I opened my mouth. And about 2 weeks later, I got an email saying, good news, you're going to be running a panel next year. I'm like, oh, no, you misunderstood. I don't have the answers. I have a lot of questions. She said, oh, that's perfect. So I spent several months looking for people that had the answers, and it led me to the Institute of the Future, and I was talking with a lovely person, Lynn Jeffries, and we hit it off, and we talked about what's coming and talking with folks in DARPA, talking to different people, and he said, what you really need to talk to is you need to talk to Dylan. So I was introduced to Dylan, and we started to have some conversations about what's coming and what's next and some of the things that are going on currently. And I knew that we had what we needed. So with that, let me introduce Dylan Hendricks from the Institute for the Future, and he can talk a little bit about what he does and how that all got started as well.
Great, thank you, Bob. So my name's Dylan Hendricks. Privileged to be here with you all this morning at 8 a.m. We'll try to keep it lively for you. I know the coffee's just starting to sink in. So I'm a co-director of our umbrella research program at the Institute for the Future called the Future 50. And I'll just say a few words up front about the Institute for the Future, because I know there's probably about 100 people in here that are just trying to mentally solve for how can an institution like that possibly exist. We've been around for about 50 years. We're a nonprofit independent research organization based out of Palo Alto. The Institute actually spun out of RAND in the 60s. So a lot of the early sort of computer simulation work, a lot of the early kind of DARPA projects around the ARPANET, around the early internet were happening there. And there was a lot of research happening on the early internet with a lot of the sort of original tech pioneers, including Paul Barron, who co-invented packet switching, where they sort of saw the implications of what they were building and thought, even with just 13 nodes at the time, seeing how disruptive the internet as a structure was going to be fundamentally, and deciding they needed to get that information out there and start having conversations about what is it going to look like to have such different organizational structures. So they started this for the public kind of mission-based organization in order to help the public and organizations and governments to think strategically about the future. So one thing we always say about ourselves up front is we don't predict the future, right? And nobody can do that, so anybody tells you they can do it, run the other direction. But what we can do is we can think more systematically and methodologically about the future. So we've been doing that for 50 years, working on methodologies for that. And as MK mentioned, we have a lot of different research groups looking at sort of a lot of what we do is kind of looking at the macro forces, sort of the external forces, things that are a little bit more predictive, things like demographics, technology pipelines, climate change, these kind of external factors that are going to influence everybody's decision-making no matter what, that can start to form a little bit of some constraints around what the future could be like. And then on the other side of that, looking at what we call signals. So there's no facts about the future, but we do have signals of things that are going on today. We always use the William Gibson quote, the future is already here, it's just unevenly distributed. So looking at things that are small, that are happening on the edges, where you're seeing behavior change, where you're seeing people's assumptions start to change, their behavior start to change in real ways. So it's as much sort of anthropology and ethnography as technological research, although a combination of both. And then trying to think about, so 10 years out from now, if you see a bunch of signals in an area and you can start to forecast a plausible scenario. So that's a lot of what we try to help people do, is look at things that are happening today and look at what are alternative plausible scenarios of where this could be bringing us, so that we can start to envision, start to mentally simulate what those futures might be like and how we might start to sort of navigate towards them or consider issues that are going to arise, so that we're not just blindsided constantly by what's happening in front of us, which is something that's a useful, I think, capacity at this moment in time, where we're in the middle of so many different transitions across different industries. So my background is in media. I actually was in video production through the early 2000s, right, in the sort of switch to digital video. So that's where I got a lot of my start and a lot of my interest in sort of recognizing sort of kind of a finger in the wind, the changing transitional industries, was getting into digital video like right when it was first starting around 2000, teaching myself online when the film schools still weren't teaching it. And then through there, really getting interested in how do you communicate this large systems change that's happening across so many areas. So doing video with a lot of big tech companies down in the Bay Area before having the Institute as a client. And so, so my job now really is working with our research teams to also try to surface, like, what is the story here? Out of all of the data that we're seeing, out of all of these different sort of signals, how do we communicate the sort of broad direction of change that we're anticipating?
Cool.
Yeah.
And just quickly, for a little bit about myself, I've been in your chair for many years. So I started in computer graphics in 1982 and worked as a professional computer graphic artist through the broadcast industry, through the film industry, and into the game industry. I've been in games for almost 20 years now, but I was in film during the 90s, and I was in broadcast back in New York during the early 80s. So as you can hear, when I found we first started talking, Dylan and I started talking and said, you're the guy. You're the one that I need to talk to because I have a lot of questions. So the first question I asked was, all right, so if we were talking 5 years ago, right, what would you have told me then that what today would look like, right? So since we all, exactly what Gibson said, the future's already here. It's just, it hasn't hit a tipping point as far as the technology and the processes that are currently invented today. 5 years ago, what would you have told me to expect today? I know that this almost sounds counterintuitive, but we're going to take the same process and we're going to push it forward. Yeah,
exactly. So I think we would have looked at a bunch of different things from 5 years ago, but one of the biggest sort of milestones, so looking back 5 years ago, 2013 was the first year in America where more people reported getting their news from social media versus newspapers for the first time, where that crossed the 50% mark. Pew's been tracking that for quite a while. And so 2013 was the first time where you sort of have a plurality of social media as the primary news source. And even at the time, there was sort of this kind of exhaustive reporting of just the sort of the meteoric rise of the percentage of people using social media for news, which at the time was 20% of the population self-reported. That number is now closer to 70%, right? So you sort of saw it had doubled from just a couple years before. So you're starting to get people more from these distributed news networks that are much more democratized, that have fewer gatekeepers. And every 10 years, so we do these 10-year forecasts. So we believe that one of the most useful timelines to look at is 10 years, because it's not so far away that it's not going to matter to you what happens, right? But it's not so close that you're going to just use your sort of short-term strategic extrapolations. And so every 10 years, we've been around through 10 years, or 5 rounds of 10-year forecasts through 50 years. And we were looking back last year at some of my material from 2007, and recognizing that at the time, and it was a scenario that we all thought was a little bit cynical at the time, but the idea that the democratization of this kind of media through social media, moving from sort of centralized systems to more distributed systems, would allow for the potential for what we now call fake news. Like we had a full scenario about that we had sort of, we tend to do 4 scenarios, and that one is sort of the dark scenario, and you think like, okay, well, we're not going to go there. No, humanity's good. We're going to use these tools, right? So it's not that we weren't like culturally blindsided as much as everybody else by what's transpired, but you can sort of strategically map out, well, this was technically possible. I think just to finish that thought, the other thing looking 5 years ago that we could have pointed to as sort of a signal of what's now happening today across the sort of media ecosystem and the precipitous decline in trust across all media is that 2013 was the Sandy Hook shooting, where Alex Jones, who just got deplatformed this week, right, he's been in the news a lot, that was where that first big conspiracy theory that this was all hoax, that despite the voluminous evidence that we're seeing around this event happening, that it's actually all fake and there's this massive sort of conspiratorial mythology behind it, and that sort of, that spread, that became viral, where there was a lot of people that all of a sudden, but I think 15 to 20% of Americans that went, I think that's the most reasonable explanation. So this kind of confluence of sort of media starting to come from everywhere, crossing that threshold for the first time, and then really starting to see sort of an early example of what's now kind of pervasive across our media.
Cool.
Yeah.
All right, so, God, I don't know where to go with that at that point in time. Let me scrub some of that imagery out of my head.
Yeah, I'm sorry for that.
Yeah.
It's early.
I remember 15 years ago, 20 years ago, again, being in your seat in the audience and being able to create a scene, whether or not working in the movies or whatever, putting Godzilla in Manhattan or, heaven forbid, or a machine sending Jodie Foster off to the planet Vega or fill in the blank, to where it was getting to a point where I could dare people to look at what I was creating and they couldn't tell whether or not it was real or not. And we were really excited about that. We thought that was really a good idea. And a lot of SIGGRAPH at that point in time was saying, this is really what our goal is to create a world that will be, you will not know the difference between one or the other. We seem to have done a good job of that.
Yeah, yeah.
So people don't trust what they're seeing anymore. How does that affect where we're going and the world that we're in as far as talking about the changes that have happened today?
Yeah, exactly. So I think that is where we're going, and I think I would take a step back. And so looking at sort of a 10-year horizon, I think the thing that we're seeing that's happening now, that we're getting lots of signals of, that in 5 years we're going to have sort of, where maybe the conversation will be gelling around, is this idea that not only have we sort of produced this capacity now for creating kind of simulations, visual simulations that would pass a kind of visual Turing test, right? In the sense that more often than not, you wouldn't necessarily be able to tell if what you're looking at is a simulation or not. It's not just that we have that capacity, but very quickly we've moved from having that capacity of creating sort of any scenario we can imagine sort of tangibly and viscerally and compellingly through some kind of visual simulation technology, but that is moving from an institutional capacity, something where the largest firms, the ILMs of the world, right, the biggest firms in the world can do that, to something where that is also now very quickly becoming a democratized capacity and mainstreaming, right? So I would use the analogy, I think that this period that we're in terms of what visual simulations as an overall industry are going through is similar in some ways to the advent of the printing press, right, in the sense that you had sort of, at the time, formal literacies, like of actual reading and writing and publishing, as being something that was entirely contained within institutions that had the ability to hire scribes in order to transcribe these and publish them and distribute them. A huge amount of effort, right? Very analogous today to thinking about what it takes to make a Jurassic Park or something similar.
I was going to say I was one of those.
I know, yeah.
I was a scribe.
That's right.
You guys are scribes, right?
So that's a capacity. So you helped develop that, and you've been a part of that, and that's been my entire life has been sort of watching that technology go from kind of 8-bit to amazing, right? And so what you had at the time was you moved from institutional literacy, where only a few people needed to be literate because they were the ones reading the few books that there were, to suddenly you have mainstream literature out in the world. And so suddenly you need mainstream literacies around how to navigate that. And there actually was, interestingly, sort of a kind of a fake news explosion right around the printing press coming out, because suddenly there was pamphlets in the wild that couldn't have existed before that had kind of, whatever sort of false information people wanted in them. And there was a similar sort of feedback loop where people weren't used to having to evaluate critically what they were seeing, because the gatekeeping was so solid that if it was coming out, you knew it was legitimate. So similarly, I think where we're going is this ability for anybody to create a lifelike photorealistic simulation of any scenario they can conjure, of any people that they can imagine, and that this is going to form the need for more like mainstream literacies around what are the... I mean, I think that a lot of people's brains turn off when you talk about like the ethics of a giant field, but really thinking about the nuances of not just what is this stack of technologies that allow us to do this, but what is the actual practice area, right? So visual simulation is now something that is involved increasingly in almost every sector as a tool for not just in terms of the visual rendering, but the physics engines that are part of it, the feedback loops, the kind of capacities that those open up for simulation. And that this is now something that everybody is going to have not necessarily the deep technical acuity in order to navigate, but the literacy of being able to tell what are the characteristics of the visual simulations I'm engaging with, and the authenticity, the provenance of them is going to be one of those things we're going to have to tease out. But because we can create them for ourselves, we're also going to have to think about how do we use these responsibly. So that might sound a little abstract at 8:30 in the morning, but sort of one really kind of grounded example of that just came out from over this weekend. So what my wife and I we were down in Seattle before I came up over here, and my wife was flying out with our children back to Austin where we live, and she was flying out on Saturday morning right after this guy stole a plane from the Seattle airport, right?
Yeah, I flew there at the same time.
Yeah, and so the airport was closed down and everything, and one of the most interesting things that's been coming out about the story, so for those who didn't hear, there was this young guy, I think in his 20s, that was sort of a mechanic, and he serviced the planes, and he didn't have any flying credentials or certifications or experience formally in the world, right? He just went, and then he just decided, I guess it was a little bit of he knew he wasn't going to make it back necessarily, but he said, I'm going to steal a plane and sort of joyride a plane. And everybody afterwards was asking, like, how did this guy know how to do this? Like, we never thought to put security protocols in because he's not a pilot. Planes are very complicated. And through the air traffic control conversations with him while he was joyriding, they realized like he had taught himself how to fly entirely from a simulator. That the simulations of flying have become so effective, not just in terms of their visual fidelity, but in terms of the actual, through a mechanism like VR, the actual sort of muscle memory and the mental modeling that is communicated through that he taught himself how to fly a plane, not just to the point, he eventually crashed, which I think was his plan anyway. But before that, he was doing barrel rolls. He was doing like a lot of tricks, and the air traffic control was asking, like, who are you, and how do you know how to do this? But, we're kind of entering this sort of matrixy period where you can, you don't know what deep technical skills somebody's going to have learned from a simulation that they engaged in on their phone or in their home computer through a Vive or an Oculus Rift, right? So I think that's kind of the implication space we need to think about, is that when they get good enough, which they now are, and easy enough to make, these simulations are incredibly powerful tools that are not just going to be used with great difficulty to sort of demonstrate things we're interested in, but that are going to become an increasingly important and foundational part of our media ecosystem at a foundational level, right? So just thinking about a scenario 10 years from now where everybody can make any simulation of any scenario they can imagine and share it with people with great fidelity, that creates a different world, right? That makes me, there's a Canadian media critic, Marshall McLuhan, who has the quote, we shape our tools, and thereafter our tools shape us. And I think that's kind of the broad space that I'm really interested in right now, doing a lot of deep research on.
Wow. So we also have a couple of mics open here. If there are any questions as we're talking, please feel free to come up. Yeah. We can try that quickly.
Yeah.
Yeah, this could go philosophical, could go in any number of different directions.
You get to choose which way it goes.
Yeah. I want to get a little grounded, I guess.
Okay.
I have a question. You've probably heard the term Industry 4. Maybe you've heard of that.
Yeah.
Certainly for the future.
Yeah.
What are your thoughts? I don't want to redirect the conversation so much, but that's my question and interest for sure in the areas of augmented reality and virtual reality.
Yeah.
Where do you see those technologies going within the next 10 years in relation to Industry 4? Like you got 3D scanning.
Yeah.
The gathering of the as-built, the gathering of reality.
Yeah.
How is that going to feed in? I think you know where I'm going with that. It's
probably the metaverse as well.
Yeah.
Yeah, I do. Yeah, and we're doing a lot of research right now at the Institute for the Future. And I do think, so I'll sort of tie this back to the previous thread. I think right now what we're experiencing is a lot of sort of disparate technology trends that are being treated like industries on their own, like VR, for example, right? VR right now is considered sort of an industry that people are like, oh, it was meant to be just exactly like video games except for more, and it's not quite panning out. I think, VR and AI is kind of similar, and sort of big data. We had this sort of big, a lot of hype a few years ago around we're going to have smart cities everywhere, we're going to have this Internet of Things, and really that mostly just sounds like a series of security downsides, right, with very few kind of, it's like, every now and then you get to have to put your password into your phone to turn your lights on, right? There's a lot of sort of things to work out there. But I think in 5-10 years, once you get to the horizon that you're talking about, that really what these technologies are is these are all pieces of simulation as a practice area. That right now we think of them as these very discrete sort of technology trends that on their own are kind of incomplete, right? VR is sort of like the personal computer in the early 80s, right? People were saying, like, why would you need a personal computer? Because there was no media that was produced and published entirely across personal computers. And so you need that sort of media specific to the technology. And I think simulations, there's a lot of signals that are coming out that simulations, like I guess I would express it this way, that I think the most important file format of the future is the simulation file format. So you can sort of see that starting today where you look at something like the Apple technology stack, and that there's now, when you take a photo with your iPhone, right, there's more non-optical metadata associated with that photo file than just the file. So to call it like a picture that we're taking is increasingly sort of misrepresentative of what you're actually doing. Right. What you're doing, especially if you're using sort of the front-facing camera, which is doing sort of 3D scanning, it's incorporating metadata about location, it's doing sort of like entity matching, it's trying to like understand like your entire context, as well as the context the photo was taken in, and then increasingly model the scene around you, right? So that what you're actually taking is like you have a thumbnail, which is the photo, which is the thing we are ostensibly doing, and around that you're getting a model, right? And so I think that idea that all of our sensors are increasingly trying to create sophisticated models of the things that we're observing, and that what those models are is the models are then basis for simulation, right? And that you can then sort of run that up and down the stack in terms of thinking about if the model is the point of the focus, and the model is not just something that's being affected to sort of represent something just visually, like just trying to trick somebody into thinking like, oh, this is an explosion, right? Like I tend to think of it, there's this progression that I see through kind of physics engines-based simulations where things move from affected, where you have 2D sprites in the background that don't actually, if you actually were to go in and inspect it, it doesn't hold up from more than one angle than what it was intended from, right? We all start from there. That's the easiest effect to produce. And then you model it. so that you could sort of view it from multiple angles and have more flexibility with it. And more ability to represent the real world, and then you move to procedurally generated, where you have the ability to then sort of contextually fill in. That I think all of our simulations are moving this way. So one of the outcomes I think of it is that the technology stack is going to gel together into this practice area in the same way that like early electronics gelled into sort of personal computing as a medium, and that we're going to have to start thinking a lot more about the humanities and liberal arts side of the technology. So it's not just sort of like how do we make this work, but like what do we do with this, right? So maybe moving, like the philosophy is going to become more practically relevant in terms of thinking like we now have this powerful medium. What is it for? What do we do with it? Where do we integrate it into education? Where do we integrate it into training, right? Where do we do all of these different things? Because that power is going to be there.
That actually, there's a little segue from that. There's been an awful lot of attention as far as saying that, at least in the United States, going towards STEM education.
Yeah.
Right? And from the very beginning, being an artist, I'm like, what are you guys, nuts?
Yeah.
You have to include the arts in that as far as for design. And I mean, just look at the successful companies, certainly in Silicon Valley, but in the tech industry, it's everybody has to wear different hats constantly. And I look at that and say, with the progress and things that are going on, the trends that are happening as far as computers starting to do self-coding, how many people are actually going to be engineers in a group? Generally the percentages aren't any more than 20, 25%, or they're probably less than that. I understand that there needs to be a literacy in coding, in tech. Just like there needs to be literacy in math. I'm not going to be a mathematician. Just like there needs to be literacy in the arts or in English or in the sciences. What are your thoughts on as far as where we're going as far as education, what that looks like? And does that make sense to you? Or?
It does, yeah. I think this is something we look at a lot at the Institute for the Future in terms of looking at emerging work skills, what's going to be important. And like you, I do think that there's a very real need right now where if you are sort of like inclined towards STEM, obviously that's not a bad direction to go in, right? So there's nothing, STEM is an incredibly practical, lucrative, and necessary set of skills. But this idea that we're going to sort of turn everybody into a STEM student focused on the engineering side of the equation, I do think I'm a skeptic about that as well. And I think so. I'm gonna just briefly go a little philosophical for a second. So bear with me because it'll loop back around. But one of the things that's been really interesting to me doing this deep research on the notion of simulation is that simulation is one of these terms that gets used increasingly ubiquitously. It's used across, it's increasingly sort of the defining metaphor of neuroscience in terms of thinking about the brain, right? So
I was going to ask you what you meant by simulation before, because that it probably means 100 things, different things to,
exactly,
to the
yeah.
people
It's
in
one
the
of these terms, and it's kind of like the term like gravity before Newton, right? So that term existed before he defined it in terms of specific trajectories and velocities, but it was just used to describe this phenomenon that everybody could understood and accepted but didn't understand, right? So that you throw something up and it comes down, that's gravity. Okay, well, what does that mean? We're in a similar place with simulation. And what's interesting is that the term, the way we use it in the modern context, has actually only been used that way since the late 1960s. So it's a brand new term. It's like about a 50-year-old term in terms of the idea we have of simulation and the matrixy kind of way of simulation, or in the way that everybody's involved in today. Before that, the term existed, but it just meant lying. It was sort of like just a deceptive kind of imitation of something, which is maybe appropriate. Maybe we need to sort of like haul that definition back up.
That might not be a bad idea.
Yeah, especially this sort of deep fake phenomenon and things like that. But this is a new phenomenon, and what's interesting to me about it is I got really interested because this term is being used, there's like kind of pseudo-religions starting around the world as a simulation, right? This is coming into the public consciousness. And then we also have this mental simulation research, but that term is not specifically defined across all of these different terrains and industries in which it's being used. And so I think we're at the moment now, like with gravity, where we finally have the feedback loops through technical simulation to be able to define simulation. And this is where I'll bring it back to education. And I think one of the ways that that's going to manifest itself is that in the research I've been doing, and my background's in psychology from an education perspective, is that when we're mentally simulating something, right? And so we get back into thinking about what are the humanities, what are physics, what is a college degree? Essentially what you're doing with a college degree is you are creating you are exposing yourself to specific mental models of how the world works that are like heuristics with characteristics that you can run information through, that you can process the world through different lenses. And we've carried those as mental simulations just socially through the disciplines of, sociology has its mental model of the world that it'll process everything through. Economics has its mental model of the world. Physics has its mental model of the world. And what we can do with simulation technologies, I think the promise of them and where we're going, to your point, is that we have taken some of those models, like physics. We've gotten really good at externalizing the mental model of physics into something that you can run as an active, continuous program, right, to the point where you can accelerate the development of cars because the safety ratings can be simulated to such great effect. I think where we're going is we're going to need to, in the same way that externalizing of our mental models is incredibly useful for our facility in collaborating on those models, that where we're going to go next is starting to develop, like, what does it look like to externalize and simulate the economic mental model? To actually take this out of just people's head who are going to argue past each other because every economist has a slightly different version of it, but to actually externalize it in a simulation environment using a combination of AI and simulation tools to say, like, what are the assumptions and constraints of an economic model? How do we look at that together? How do we create scenarios out of that? And then moving through to, okay, what is the actual sort of rules and assumptions that we can externalize and manifest around a sociological mental model around, so taking these humanities things, these things that help us decide not just what to do, but why we should do it, and putting those into this medium so that these debates become less sort of these kind of, I think this is kind of the symptom of this post-truth era, is everybody now feels entitled to their own complete model of the world, and that there's no experts anymore, right? Which is why you have something like flat earthism as a growing movement in 2018, right? Because everybody's mental models are so fragmented, the world is so complex. We need to actually create sort of like the Wikipedia of mental models, and what are they? What are the assumptions? How do we create that feedback loop? And I really think this is the opportunity of what the simulation space is. So if you can create a scenario and you can take these assumptions and you can manifest them visually so people can experience them together, then you can start to have actual productive conversations about a shared consensus reality again, right? That's I think, how we kind of also get out of this current mess, is by bringing humanities back to the technology.
So you would, if you had a couple of teenage kids, kind of like maybe I do, you would be saying, go get a good liberal arts education, and focus on the humanities as well as the other areas.
And play a lot of Minecraft.
And play a lot of Minecraft.
Yeah.
They've done that already.
Well, because I do think the humanities, I do think get it. Well, I mean, it depends on your inclination, right? I think it takes all types. If you're the kind of person that you want to get into, like, how is everything rendered, that's great. You should do that. But I think we shouldn't be pushing the young people that don't have that inclination, that have a more artistic inclination, a more empathetic inclination. One of the great things about something like virtual reality as a sort of an interaction mechanism for simulations is it is so much more intuitive and accessible than the previous rounds of technologies have been. I think that's the other benefit we get going forward. We have, with our emerging media lab at the Institute, I have a VR setup at home, and so I love running people through like a Vive kind of experience for the first time. And one of the big sort of things that's kind of amazing to me is that I'll take people like my mother, for example, who would never be able to internalize the mental model of a computer well enough to use Photoshop, right? Photoshop is just the barrier of entry is too high. You have to model how Photoshop works, how computer works beneath that, how to like interact with it. So Photoshop's out. But you can put her into a tilt brush or an experience like that, hand somebody a digital paintbrush, and they can create something more elaborate than anybody could ever create in Photoshop, right? In terms of the depth of it, in terms of the fidelity and your experience of it, with the least amount of sort of specific technical domain knowledge of what the tool is that you're using, right? So I think this is the thing where we're going to be able to, people are going to need some basic technological literacies, but the ability to put somebody who's just thinking about how do we organize ourselves, how do we relate to each other, into a simulation environment, getting them to express their assumptions and then into something that's workable and functional, that's really the opportunity space, right?
Yeah.
So like one quick example of that is thinking about like policy simulations, right? If you look at sort of the level of discourse of how we negotiate what policies to implement, the simulations that we're doing of what that policy will do to affect the economy are entirely rhetorical at the moment, right? We have such a low baseline economically as well, right? And economic models, right? We model it, we simulate alternative scenarios of how the economy is going to turn out, but that bar of how low resolution that model is is so easily surpassable. So I think anything where we can model it with better sophistication, we're going to get sort of incremental gains in our ability to use it usefully. So that's kind of where I'm thinking. Sorry, I've thrown a few things at you there.
Yeah. I have to backtrack just for a moment. All right. So one of the things that I'm concerned about.
Yeah.
Right? So we're moving more into a world of higher fidelity, higher realism. The simulation is getting more democratized.
Yeah.
So what you're saying is it's going to get worse before it gets better.
It absolutely is going to get worse before
That's
it gets
wonderful.
better. Yeah.
Good. And,
we should
and the other
anticipate
thing
that
you're saying
plan
is
accordingly.
everyone in this room's created this problem.
Yes.
Oh, thank
it's
you
all
very
your
much.
fault.
Good.
Yeah.
We're all complicit.
Yeah.
Great. Thank you very much, everybody.
Yeah, that's why
we're doomed.
This format's really judge and jury kind of. Yeah.
Anyway, how are we going to fix this? I mean, and I guess what I'm hoping for is you're going to tell me that we're all going to work hard, and we're all going to create some levels of transparency in the process of what we're doing, so that when people are getting their interesting stories created by robots on some social media site, and I need to be able to look at that and say, is this real or not? I need to be able to. For the love of God, I need to be able to look at a video and say, is this a deepfake video, or is this real? Can I mouse over it? I mean, or am I just going to have to power through this and go, oh God, everyone's going to be making these things that are going to get closer to crossing the uncanny valley, and I know I've just hit you with about 4 questions.
No, yeah,
and you're all responsible, so we all have to fix it.
What do we do about this?
Right.
This mess? Yeah,
There
and this kind of inevitable. We are going to have an incident in the near future where there is some video evidence of something that is a major plot point in our narrative about what's going on in the world, whether it's a political event or something, and the authenticity and provenance of that video is going to be questioned.
Right.
And we're going to find ourselves in very soon not able to answer the question really to anybody's satisfaction of whether or not this person was actually there, whether or not they said this actual thing. The combination of sort of the sort of deepfake videos, right, which also demonstrates the ability to do that, but also the democratization of that, right? There's some phone apps that create very good sort of simulations that way, and then the ability to simulate somebody's voice, right, through Lyre and things Adobe and other companies are working on.
Right.
That we are going to get there, so we need to anticipate that. But I believe that the only way out is through. So I kind of have, there's sort of, I think, a technological component to it, and then a very not technological component to that. And I do think that one of the technological component is really just, like I sort of mentioned before, alluded to, the development of literacies through repeated mass exposure to this new medium. Right? So I think for the next few years, that's going to come out in the sense of, if you want to be more sure that a video is real, capture 12 angles of it. Because then you're going to, it sort of is like the logic of blockchain, like just make it harder for somebody to fake it, right? Increase the cost of faking it by filming it from so many angles that it's going to take a lot of work. I was thinking
of blockchain as far as potentially being a solution as far as for source and credibility and locking it.
Yeah, and I'm careful about that right now because the blockchain as a solution so far has mostly been a solution to, like, how can we waste more energy and get very little value out of it. But I think I am kind of a long-term bull on blockchain in the sense that I do think, when you look at sort of like the problem of data ownership, nobody wants to own it, we don't trust anybody to own it, that the blockchain creates an elegant potential solution if we can figure out how to make it viable. And it's being used in things like, the example I always think of is in Honduras, where you have a land registry, nobody trusts the provenance of the land registry because the office can be corrupted or bought off. So if you put sort of a title deed into the blockchain, then it's much harder to manipulate further on to say, like, oh, I actually bought this property. So I think some version of that within simulations where you can sort of say, I know specifically who created this media, right? And I know that they sort of put their biometrics on. There's some components of that.
I heard DARPA was working on something in that.
Yeah, DARPA's working on those things. I mean, a lot of people, because this is like existential to our media ecosystem right now, right, where nobody trusts anything that the government or media is saying, and across most of the West, right? The only outliers of that are China and India. The rest of the world, nobody trusts anything anymore, which is something we've also been doing a lot of research on. So trying to find our way back through some technical solutions is going to become important. I think there's also going to be some funny things that we're going to develop. Like one of the things with deepfakes currently that's harder to sort of simulate is if somebody's like eating, right? And something's like occluding the mouth in a really specific way. That's hard. Like that's where you're going to see more seams of where the machine learning is trying to model something that it doesn't have exact reference points for. So we might ask like politicians to like eat on stage, right? Well, in order to like, you know, there's going to be these kinds of hacks. On the other side of it, I think that there's also people solutions to that, where the only way that we're going to know for sure in 10 years whether a video is real or not is if you know somebody who was in the room when it was happening, right? That's going to be the ultimate thing. So I think we're going to have to rely on some of our, like, you know, there was this dream that maybe with blockchain and the internet we would never have to like talk to each other again in real life. Right. I think maybe we're going to have to go back on that and start to develop a little bit more of the sort of the social trust that, like, I know you and you were there and you tell me this happened, and so you're vouching for it. Is probably going to be more effective for me than any kind of blockchain sort of output into a terminal window, you know, is going to be. So I think that's the other part of it, is we need to build up the social structures around this.
I see the hook is here.
Oh, the hook already.
So what have we learned today? Humans matter is what we've learned today. So thank you so much. This is a great show, a great presentation for our first ever SIGGRAPH Next. The conversation will continue online. Keep your eyes peeled for the SIGGRAPH Conferences Facebook page as well as our Twitter page. Next year for this session, we'll be doing, these gentlemen were obviously curated, we will be doing a call for participation. So if you have some really interesting questions and or answers, keep your eye peeled for our call for participation to support. We hope to see you tomorrow and Wednesday for our sessions on medicine and the future of education. Thank you so much to our speakers, Bob and Dylan.